Prologue. The frozen silence. The airport had fallen into an impossible stillness. Outside the wide glass walls, an aircraft stood motionless, its silver wings now heavy with ice. Snow clung to its engines, and icicles hung like teeth from its frame. The tarmac, once busy with flashing lights and moving vehicles, looked like a graveyard carved in frost. Inside, the passengers had gathered in disbelief. Breath fogged in the air, the floor creaked with ice spreading underfoot, and even the hum of electricity seemed to falter. Time itself felt frozen. A man in a business suit clutched his chest, his mouth open in a silent scream. A woman held her child tighter, rocking him as though warmth could be willed into existence. Uniformed officers stared at the storm beyond the glass, their expressions stiff with dread. It was not just the cold that terrified them, it was the silence. A silence too deep, too sudden, too final. And in that silence, every heart remembered war. Because war, too, lives in an instant. Chapter 1. Before the freeze. Hours earlier, the airport had been alive with routine. Travelers hurried through the halls, announcements echoed from the speakers, and luggage wheels clicked across polished floors. None of them could have known what awaited. Among the travelers was Daniel Clark, a man in his late 30s. He adjusted his tie nervously as he waited at gate 14. To strangers, he looked like another businessman. But inside, he carried grief sharp enough to cut him in half. Only a month ago, Daniel had buried his younger brother, a soldier lost in a distant war. Now, he was flying not for work but to escape. To escape the quiet apartment where memories haunted him, to escape the folded flag sitting on his mantle. He hoped distance could numb the pain, though deep down he knew pain follows everywhere. Across the hall sat Elena Petrova, holding her infant son, Artem. She kept glancing at the departure board, as if willing her flight to leave sooner. Her coat was worn, her hair unkempt, but her eyes carried fire. Elena had lost her home, her husband, and nearly everything else to war. All she had left was the boy pressed against her chest. He slept peacefully, unaware that his mother's arms were the last shield between him and despair. For Elena, this flight meant survival. It meant a chance to start over, to find a place where Artem could grow without hearing sirens in the night. Every time she looked at his tiny hands, she whispered a promise: "You will live free, my son. I will not let war steal you, too." Near the coffee stall stood Captain Richard Hayes, suitcase by his side. His crisp pilot's uniform drew the eyes of nearby passengers. Some smiled at him, reassured by the quiet authority he carried. Richard nodded politely, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He was a man who had spent his life in the skies, ferrying souls across continents. Yet behind his calm demeanor lived memories of flying through war zones, missions where his cargo wasn't tourists with luggage but wounded civilians and emergency supplies. He had seen what war did from above, entire cities scarred black, families waving from refugee camps. For him, flying was never just travel, it was trust. Every soul aboard his planes depended on him. And he carried that weight like armor. Sitting quietly near the window, barely noticed, was Private Amir Khan, a young soldier no older than 22. His military leave had been approved only days earlier. His uniform was neatly folded in his bag, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He had seen too much for his age: villages turned to rubble, friends lost in firefights, and children looking at him with eyes too wise, too broken. Amir carried no medals in his bag, no photographs, only silence. War had hollowed him, and yet he still longed for home. He wondered if his family would recognize him, or if the war had carved him into someone unrecognizable. These 4 lives, so different yet so scarred by the same shadow, war, crossed paths unknowingly that day. They waited under the same roof, hearing the same boarding calls, sipping the same bitter coffee. They were strangers, bound only by coincidence. But soon, coincidence would shatter. The world outside would turn white. And in that frozen silence, their stories would intertwine. Chapter 2. Shadows of War. The airport's glass walls still shimmered with frost, but inside the minds of the stranded passengers, another storm raged, a storm of memory. Each person who sat frozen in silence carried a world within them, a story woven with the threads of war, love, and survival. The man in the suit, whose scream had echoed first, was named Daniel Clark. Just weeks before, he had been sitting in a quiet office in London, staring at photographs of his younger brother, Michael. Michael was a soldier, deployed overseas. The last letter Daniel received was filled with hope. Michael had written about how the war was finally ending, how he would come home soon. But war has a way of swallowing promises. Instead of Michael, a flag-draped coffin returned. Daniel had never cried at the funeral. He had stood straight, fists clenched, heart frozen. Yet here, at the airport, as the snowstorm of impossible proportions sealed the world outside, he could no longer hold it back. The sight of the frozen airplane reminded him of Michael's coffin, cold and untouchable. Everything ends in silence, Daniel whispered to himself, his voice cracking. Nearby, the woman clutching her child was Elena Petrova, a refugee from a war-torn village. She had boarded flight after flight, crossed border after border, only to find herself once again trapped, this time not by bombs, but by ice. Her child, a boy named Artem, pressed his tiny face into her coat. Elena's mind drifted back to her home. The smell of fresh bread her mother used to bake. The sound of her husband's laughter when Artem was born. But then came the bombs. Her husband had joined the resistance, and one night he never returned. The house was reduced to rubble. Now she was here, carrying what little remained of her life in her arms. Her son, her reason to breathe. Don't cry, Artem, she whispered, though her own tears froze on her cheeks. Mama is here, always. She kissed the child's forehead, ignoring the cold sting of ice. To her, survival was no longer for herself, it was for him. The man in uniform, standing tall with his suitcase, was Captain Richard Hayes, an airline pilot. Unlike the others, he wore no expression of fear. Instead, he carried the weight of responsibility. His flight had been grounded just minutes before takeoff, and now his passengers looked to him with desperate eyes. He had seen war before, not on the battlefield, but in the skies. Years ago, during a conflict in the Middle East, Richard had been flying humanitarian missions. He had carried wounded children, mothers with broken arms, fathers with empty eyes. He had watched entire towns from above, reduced to ash and dust. Flying, for him, was never just about travel, it was about carrying lives, carrying hope. Now, standing in the frozen terminal, Richard clenched his fists. I won't let this end like war ends, he muttered. He didn't know what force had turned the airport into an icy tomb, but he knew one thing, people survived wars not just with weapons but with unity. And then, there was the young soldier sitting silently near the window, Private Amir Khan. He hadn't spoken since the freeze began. His eyes were hollow, his body shivering, but not from the cold. Memories of battlefields haunted him. Amir had enlisted out of duty, out of love for his homeland. But when he closed his eyes, he saw faces, friends he couldn't save, civilians caught in crossfire, children clutching broken toys amid ruins. He wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for forgiveness, but his voice was gone. War had stolen it from him. Now, watching the frozen plain outside, Amir whispered in his native tongue, Ya Allah, forgive me. Each of them was a survivor of war in one form or another, some had fought, some had lost, some had only run. And now they were bound together, not by nationality or language, but by a shared silence. The ice on the windows thickened. Outside, the engines of the plane groaned under the weight of frost. Inside, people huddled closer, drawn by the instinct that humanity is strongest when united against the storm. Elena looked at Daniel and asked softly, why do wars never end? Daniel turned his tear-streaked face toward her, his voice trembling. Because humanity forgets too quickly what it feels like to lose everything. Richard, standing tall, added, then we must remember, for them, for ourselves. He nodded toward Artem, asleep in his mother's arms. So that children like him don't grow up in a world where silence means death. For a moment, the frozen airport wasn't just a prison. It was a mirror, reflecting the scars left by every war, every battle, every goodbye that humanity had ever endured. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the glass, but inside, a fragile warmth began to spark. Not from the heaters, not from the lights, but from hearts remembering what it meant to be human.